Have you ever been absolutely certain that something was going to happen, and seconds later realized you were completely wrong? That feeling of "I was sure of it," followed by a slight shock when reality doesn't match what your mind anticipated. It could be a conversation you thought would be tense but ended up being calm. A date you swore would go wrong but took an unexpected turn. Or even that strange feeling that something was too familiar, even without any logical explanation. If this has ever happened to you, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. We like to believe that we perceive the world as it really is. That our senses capture reality directly, objectively, almost like a camera recording everything around us. But the truth is far more disconcerting. The human brain doesn't wait for reality to happen before reacting. It tries to predict what comes next all the time. Even before you hear a complete sentence, the brain has already guessed the ending. Before an event happens, it has already constructed an entire scenario in your mind. And most of the time this works so well that you don't even realize it. The problem begins when this prediction fails. When the brain errs in predicting reality, the feeling isn't one of doubt, it's one of bewilderment, of confusion, sometimes even discomfort. And the most curious thing is that, even when wrong, the brain continues to act as if it were right. Emotions arise, reactions occur, judgments are formed, all based on something that never came true. Have you ever experienced this? That automatic reaction that, looking back, didn't make much sense? This type of error doesn't mean inattention, mental weakness, or an overactive imagination. On the contrary, it's the result of a sophisticated mechanism that exists to protect us and make our responses faster. The brain is an anticipation machine. It combines memories, emotions, patterns, and past experiences to create predictions about what is about to happen. This saves energy and time. In evolutionary terms, predicting was more important than always being right. However, in the modern world, this system doesn't always work in our favor. When you enter a new environment, when you are anxious, tired, or emotionally charged, the brain tends to rely even more on these internal predictions than on the actual information coming through the senses. That's when strange sensations, misinterpretations, and that firm certainty about something that simply doesn't correspond to the facts arise. The brain isn't trying to deceive you, it's trying to help in the way it has learned over thousands of years. Perhaps now some experiences from your own life will begin to make more sense. That exaggerated reaction, that frustrated expectation, that feeling that reality escaped for a moment. All of this is linked to how the brain constructs an anticipated version of the world. And the more confidence it has in this prediction, the more real it seems even when it's wrong. What's most intriguing is that we rarely perceive this process happening. To the conscious mind, the prediction arrives already formed as if it were a fact. That's why the error seems so convincing. And that's exactly where the mystery lies that we're going to explore from now on. Because understanding when and why the brain errs in predicting reality completely changes the way you see your own perceptions. So stay with me, because from here on out we're going to delve deeper into this invisible mechanism that shapes what you feel, think, and believe you're seeing, even when reality decides to take a different path. And perhaps, as you listen to all this, a specific memory has come to mind. A moment when you reacted with absolute conviction, felt something intensely, made a quick decision, and only then realized that reality was different. If this topic resonates with you, if at any point you thought, "This has happened to me," it's really worth leaving that here in the comments. Sharing your own experience isn't just a venting session. It's a way of showing that these feelings are more common than they seem, and that no one is alone when the brain fails to predict what's coming next. When you comment, you're not just talking to me. You're creating space for other people to recognize themselves, read, identify with, and better understand their own minds. This exchange creates something powerful, a sense of community around topics that almost no one explains in this way. And if this content is making you reflect, question, or see your experiences with different eyes, liking the video is a simple but very important way to show that. This gesture helps the video reach more people who may be experiencing the exact same doubts as you. And if you feel that this type of content resonates with you, subscribing to the channel is like saying, "I want to continue exploring this." The idea here isn't to provide ready-made answers, but to provoke better questions about how the brain works, perception, and the reality we believe we are seeing. Your participation is what keeps this space alive, relevant, and growing. It's what allows more videos like this to continue to exist. So feel free to participate in whatever way makes the most sense to you. And in the meantime, stick with me, because now that you understand that the brain doesn't expect reality, it tries to guess, the next step is to take a closer look at what happens when that prediction simply doesn't work as it should. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding that the brain doesn't wait for reality, it tries to guess, completely changes how we see our own minds. Most people grow up believing that the brain functions like a sophisticated camera. Reality happens outside, the senses capture this information, and the mind simply registers what is happening. But this is a comfortable illusion. In practice, the brain is constantly working behind the scenes, trying to predict the next second before it arrives. What you perceive as a gift is already loaded with expectation. Even before your eyes fully process a scene, the brain has already created a hypothesis about what you are about to see. Before a word is finished, it has already decided what the end of the sentence will be. Before a situation unfolds, it has already assembled an internal script. This is not a system error, it is exactly how it was designed to work. Predicting is faster than analyzing everything from scratch, and speed has always been a decisive advantage in our journey as a species. This constant prediction mechanism is an energy-saving strategy. Thinking deeply about every detail of reality would be too costly in biological terms. So the brain prefers to use shortcuts, patterns, past experiences, and emotional signals to anticipate what comes next. It makes a bet. And most of the time, this bet works well enough for us to get through the day without noticing anything strange. The problem isn't the act of predicting itself, but the confidence the brain places in these predictions. When you enter a familiar situation, the brain activates pre-existing models. It already knows how it usually ends. But reality isn't obligated to follow the mental script that was created. And when it doesn't, that internal short circuit occurs. The feeling that something is out of place. A subtle discomfort. Sometimes, an emotional reaction that seems too big for what actually happened. This is the direct impact of a predictive system that didn't match the facts. There's a hidden truth in all of this that's rarely discussed. The brain prefers a good, coherent story to a complex truth. It wants meaning, continuity, internal logic. When reality threatens to break that coherence, the mind tries to adjust it. Not because you want to deceive yourself, but because the brain needs to maintain a functional narrative of the world. This narrative underpins decisions, behaviors, and even how you construct your identity. That's why you often react before you realize. You decide before you reflect. You feel before you understand. The brain has already made a quick assessment of the situation and triggered a response based on past predictions. This influences choices, relationships, judgments, and even how you interpret other people's intentions. We're not just talking about sensory perception but about mindset, thought patterns, and how the mind shapes the reality you believe you are living. When this system works well, it's almost invisible. But when it fails, it reveals itself in a strange way. A neutral comment seems offensive. Silence becomes rejection. A trivial detail takes on disproportionate weight. The brain isn't reacting to what's happening now, but to what it believes is happening, based on internal predictions. That's when the boundary between reality and interpretation begins to blur. This process also explains why two people can experience the same situation and come away with completely different experiences. Each brain carries its own models, its own expectations, its own emotional background. The external reality is the same, but the internal version that each person constructs can be radically different. And the more automatic this prediction, the more real it seems to the person experiencing it. There's something almost fascinating about all of this. The brain isn't trying to discover the absolute truth of the world. It's trying to keep you functional within it. If that requires it to simplify, anticipate, or even slightly distort reality, it will do so without hesitation. This is the basis of many strange phenomena of the human mind, and also the root of countless internal and external conflicts that are part of our journey. When you begin to see the brain as a predictive system, many experiences take on new meaning. That feeling of certainty that later proves to be wrong. That reaction you don't understand why you had. That emotional conviction that doesn't hold up when analyzed calmly. None of this arises from nothing. They are revelations of a deep, silent, and extremely efficient mechanism, until the moment it isn't. And this is exactly where the conversation starts to get even more interesting. Because if the brain is constantly trying to guess the world, what happens when these predictions become stronger than the senses themselves? What changes when emotion, stress, or past experiences begin to dominate this anticipation system? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding when prediction wins over reality reveals much more about who we are, how we think, and why we sometimes have so much difficulty trusting what we are experiencing. Before we continue, if any part of this resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. There's a fundamental point that completely changes how we understand these brain errors, and it revolves around a simple but powerful idea. For the brain, predicting has always been more important than being right. When we look at this through the lens of evolution, everything starts to make sense. For most of human history, there was no room for lengthy analyses, careful deliberations, or the pursuit of absolute precision. There was time to react, or not to react. And, in that context, being wrong quickly was almost always better than reacting too late. Imagine a primitive environment full of uncertainties. A noise in the undergrowth could be just the wind, or a predator. If the brain waited for enough proof to be absolutely certain, the cost could be fatal. But if it anticipated danger and reacted immediately, even if it was wrong a few times, the chances of survival increased. This logic profoundly shaped the architecture of the human mind. The brain learned that an imperfect but quick prediction was more valuable than an accurate analysis that came too late. This is a hidden truth that often conflicts with how we would like to see ourselves. We like the idea that we are rational, careful, and objective. But, behind the scenes, the brain continues to operate with very old rules. It prioritizes protection, continuity, and adaptation. Absolute precision was never the main goal. The impact of this still reverberates today, even in a world completely different from the one that shaped us. When the brain makes a prediction, it's not seeking truth in the philosophical sense of the word. It's seeking a functional answer. Something that allows it to act, decide, move forward. This influences everything from physical reactions to complex emotional choices. Many decisions you believe you've made consciously have already come ready-made, packaged by this anticipation system that works silently all the time. Consciousness often only arrives later to justify what has already been decided. This mechanism explains why we feel fear before understanding, discomfort before thinking, rejection before confirming. The brain prefers to err on the side of caution rather than risk being caught off guard. From an evolutionary perspective, this is logical. From the perspective of modern life, not always. The same strategy that saved lives in the past can now generate anxiety, internal conflicts, and distorted interpretations of reality. There's a silent transformation that happens when you begin to notice this. You start to understand that many automatic reactions aren't a reflection of what's happening now, but of a system trained to respond to what might happen. This difference is subtle but profound. It changes how you see your thoughts, your emotions, and even your strongest convictions. That absolute conviction is often not a sign of truth, it's a sign of speed. The brain doesn't ask, is this true? But is this safe? It doesn't ask, is this necessary? But is this sufficient to act? This logic shapes the mindset with which we interpret the world. And when reality doesn't confirm these predictions, a feeling of error, of strangeness, of broken expectations arises. Even so, the brain doesn't easily abandon its bets. It prefers to adjust the narrative rather than admit that the prediction failed. This also helps explain why some beliefs persist even in the face of contrary evidence. Once a prediction proves functional, the brain tends to maintain it. It becomes part of the structure that organizes the internal world. Changing this requires effort, energy, and often discomfort. From a survival standpoint, questioning too much has not always been advantageous. From a personal growth standpoint, however, this questioning can be transformative. Throughout our journey, we have learned to trust these quick responses. They have shaped habits, emotional patterns, and ways of interpreting reality. However, in an environment where threats are no longer so immediate, this same system can generate a disproportionate impact. A look is interpreted as judgment. Silence becomes rejection. A small mistake takes on enormous weight. All of this stems from a brain that continues to prioritize prediction over accuracy. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's an even more delicate layer behind it all. If predicting is more important than being right, what happens when intense emotions, past experiences, and altered mental states begin to influence this prediction system? The brain not only anticipates the external world, but also filters this anticipation based on past experiences. Every memory, every frustration, every victory leaves traces that alter how the future is imagined. At this point, prediction ceases to be merely a survival strategy and becomes a lens through which reality is interpreted. This lens can distort, magnify, or soften what happens around us. And the more automatic it becomes, the less we realize that we are looking at the world through it. The feeling of certainty remains strong, even when the basis of that certainty is fragile. What's most fascinating is realizing that the brain doesn't do this out of malice or failure. It does it because, for a long time, this was the best strategy available. Understanding this isn't about blaming the mind, but about gaining awareness of its limits and strengths. It's about realizing that many of our reactions don't relate to the present, but to an old system trying to keep us alive, even when the danger is no longer the same. This perception opens up space for a new way of relating to one's own thoughts. Instead of accepting them as absolute truths, it's possible to see them as hypotheses, as attempts by the brain to anticipate the world. Some will be right, others won't, and that's okay. The problem arises when we forget that they are just predictions and start treating them as indisputable facts. When you begin to see what's happening behind the scenes, something changes. The way you react to your own emotions transforms. Your mindset stops being reactive and becomes more observant. Not because your brain has stopped predicting, but because you've started to notice when it's doing so. This awareness doesn't eliminate mistakes, but it reduces their impact. And that, in itself, profoundly alters how you experience your life. There is still much to explore about how this prediction system can get out of control and how certain mental states amplify these distortions. It is at this point that the revelations become even more intriguing because the brain doesn't err alone. It errs in conjunction with emotions, memories, and expectations that accumulate throughout life. And understanding this dynamic is an important step in understanding why, sometimes, reality seems so different from what it actually is. If all of this resonated with you in any way, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a delicate moment when something silent happens within the mind. Prediction begins to outweigh the senses themselves. It's as if the brain says without words, I already know what this is, even before clearly hearing, seeing, or feeling everything. And when this happens, the experience of reality begins to change subtly but profoundly. Under normal conditions, our senses function as information portals. Sight, hearing, touch. All of these constantly send data to the brain. But this data doesn't reach a neutral mind. It reaches a system that is already prepared, loaded with expectations, memories, emotions, and internal models of the world. When the prediction aligns with what the senses deliver, everything flows. You don't even notice the process. Reality seems stable, coherent, predictable. The problem begins when this harmony breaks down. When the brain has already decided what is happening before receiving enough information. In these moments, prediction wins over the senses. The mind begins to interpret reality not by what is being perceived now, but by what it believes should be happening. That's when sensations that are difficult to explain arise. A strangeness in the air. A slight confusion. An impression that something doesn't fit, even without knowing exactly what. This is one of those hidden truths that are rarely discussed clearly. Perception is not a direct line between the world and consciousness. It is a constant negotiation between what comes from the outside and what already exists within. When the brain relies too much on its predictions, it begins to correct reality so that it better fits the internal model. And this can generate profoundly disconcerting experiences. You can notice this in simple situations. A person says something in a neutral tone but you sense hostility. An environment is safe but your body reacts as if there were danger. An ordinary moment seems laden with strange meaning. None of this happens because the senses failed. They did their job. What changed was the weight the brain gave to the prediction compared to the actual information. This process has a direct impact on how we make decisions. When prediction dominates, decisions cease to be responses to the present and become reactions to imagined scenarios. The mind acts as if it were anticipating a threat, rejection, or mistake, even without concrete evidence. This shapes choices, behaviors, and even how we interpret the intentions of others. There's something almost hypnotic about it. The stronger the prediction, the more real it seems. The brain doesn't put up a warning saying, this is just a hypothesis. It presents the prediction as if it were a fact. The inner feeling comes with conviction, with emotion, with urgency. And, for the person experiencing it, the experience is completely legitimate. The confusion doesn't come from nowhere. It arises from this silent conflict between what is predicted and what is perceived. This is the point where many people begin to question their own perception. Am I exaggerating? Is there something wrong with me? But what is happening most of the time is simply an old system operating beyond what is necessary. The brain is trying to protect, anticipate, and organize. However, in doing so, it ends up creating a distance between internal experience and external reality. This disconnect is usually not extreme. It's subtle, everyday, almost imperceptible. But the impact accumulates. Small misinterpretations shape the mindset. Automatic reactions become the norm. The emotional journey begins to be guided more by predictions than by facts. And little by little, the person may begin to feel that the world is more confusing, more threatening, or more unpredictable than it actually is. The most curious thing is that, when prediction triumphs over the senses, the brain still believes it's doing the right thing. From its point of view, it makes sense to trust what has worked before. It doesn't see this as a mistake but as a strategy. However, this strategy was designed for a very different context than the current one. Today we rarely need to react in fractions of a second to survive. Even so, the system continues to function as if every situation carried an immediate risk. This mechanism helps explain why certain experiences seem so real even when, rationally, we know that something doesn't make sense. Emotion comes first, interpretation comes ready-made, and logic arrives later, trying to give coherence to what has already been felt. This is one of the most fascinating behind-the-scenes aspects of the human mind. It reveals that the reality we live is not just what happens, but what the brain decides to highlight, anticipate, and interpret. When you begin to see this, something changes in how you relate to your own perceptions. Instead of fighting against them or blindly accepting them, the possibility arises of observing them. Of perceiving when a reaction comes from an old prediction and not from the present moment. This awareness doesn't eliminate the strangeness immediately, but it creates space between you and it. And that space is already a form of transformation. This shift in perspective also alters how we understand the impact of emotions. Intense emotions tend to strengthen predictions. The more emotionally charged you are, the less the brain trusts the senses and the more it trusts its own internal models. This creates a cycle that is difficult to perceive while it is happening, but extremely powerful when viewed from the outside. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's an additional layer to this process. When specific emotional states amplify these predictions to the point of completely distorting how reality is perceived. It's in this territory that the strangest experiences arise, those where the disconnect seems greater, more intense, almost impossible to ignore. Before moving on, if this idea that prediction can overcome the senses resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, bringing it into the realm of everyday life, because it is precisely in the most common situations that the brain's prediction errors become most evident. We are not talking about rare or extreme experiences, but about small episodes that happen to many people, and which, when examined closely, reveal the same mechanism at work behind the scenes. Think about that strange feeling of entering a place or experiencing a situation and being absolutely certain that it has happened before. Not as a clear memory but as a silent, almost uncomfortable conviction. You look around, try to identify where that familiarity comes from, but find nothing concrete. Still, the feeling persists. This is not an isolated memory glitch. It's the brain crossing incomplete patterns, trying to fit the present into old models, and quickly concluding that it's already part of its history. Prediction wins over verification. The mind prefers to assume it already knows something rather than deal with uncertainty. Another common example occurs when you feel that something is going to happen. It's not an elaborate thought, it's more of an impression. A hunch. The feeling that a message is going to arrive, that someone is going to say something specific, that a situation is going to take a certain turn. The brain creates an anticipated scenario based on past experiences, current emotions, and minimal clues. When this is confirmed, the feeling of accuracy reinforces confidence in this system. But when it doesn't happen, strangeness arises. Still, the intensity of the prediction was real. The emotional impact was real. Even if the event never materialized. This type of experience reveals a hidden truth about how we deal with the future. The brain doesn't like blank spaces. It prefers to fill in what hasn't happened yet with quick hypotheses. This creates an illusion of control and predictability, something that brings comfort amidst uncertainty. But this comfort comes at a cost. When reality doesn't match the prediction, frustration, confusion, or even a feeling of internal error arise. There are also times when we interpret expressions, sounds, or situations completely wrongly. A neutral look seems judgmental. A common tone of voice sounds irritated. Silence becomes disinterest. At these times, the senses may even capture the information correctly, but the brain has already decided on the meaning before calmly analyzing it. The interpretation comes ready-made, based on past experiences, current emotional states, and unspoken expectations. Reality passes through an invisible filter that alters its impact. These errors don't appear out of nowhere. They are part of the same central process, the brain trying to anticipate, organize, and make sense of the world as quickly as possible. Instead of waiting for all the information, it acts based on what seems most likely. This shapes decisions, reactions, and even how we position ourselves in relation to people and situations. Often, we only realize the mistake after the emotional response has already occurred. What's interesting is to note how universal these experiences are. When someone describes this type of situation, it's common to hear, this has happened to me before. This recognition doesn't come from people exaggerating, but because the mechanism behind it is shared. We all have brains that operate through predictions, and we are all subject to the same mental shortcuts. The difference lies in how much we perceive them happening. Throughout life, these small predictions accumulate and influence our mindset. We begin to trust certain feelings more than concrete facts. We start to react automatically to signals that aren't always there. This affects relationships, career choices, everyday decisions, and even how we interpret ourselves. Each person's journey is marked by these moments when the mind anticipated something that never came true. There is also a significant emotional impact to all of this. When the brain makes a wrong prediction, it rarely admits the error clearly. Instead, it tries to adjust the narrative. It minimizes what happened, rationalizes it afterward, or simply ignores the discrepancy. This maintains a sense of internal coherence, but makes it difficult to perceive that the reaction was based on something imagined, not experienced. The hidden truth is that the brain prefers to preserve its internal logic rather than revise its own shortcuts. These examples show that we are not dealing with isolated phenomena, but with different manifestations of the same system. The feeling of familiarity without a clear memory, the hunch that is not confirmed, the misinterpretation of a situation, all stem from the same impulse to predict before perceiving. It is an efficient but imperfect strategy. And the more automatic it becomes, the more invisible it becomes. When you begin to recognize this pattern, something interesting happens. Instead of blaming yourself for these experiences, you start to observe them with more curiosity. The question ceases to be, "What's wrong with me?" and becomes, "What is my brain trying to do now?" This shift in perspective has a transformative effect. It creates space for more conscious choices, even within a system that continues to predict all the time. This awareness doesn't eliminate forecasting errors. They still happen. But the impact changes. The reaction is no longer immediate and becomes something to be observed. Emotion still arises, but it doesn't completely dominate. It's as if you begin to see behind the scenes of your own thinking, realizing that many certainties are, in fact, quick hypotheses disguised as reality. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because these forecasting errors don't arise randomly. They intensify in certain specific mental states, gain strength in certain contexts, and reveal clear patterns when observed carefully. It is at this point that emotion, stress, and past experiences decisively come into play, further widening the gap between what is predicted and what is experienced. Before we continue, if you recognized yourself in any of these examples, leave a comment below. This has happened to me before. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a crucial factor that completely transforms how the brain makes predictions: your emotional state. No matter how sophisticated the brain's anticipation system is, it never works in isolation. It's constantly influenced by emotions, energy levels, recent experiences, and even accumulated fatigue. And when these variables come into play, the prediction ceases to be merely inaccurate. It starts to become biased. When we are emotionally balanced, the brain tends to better reconcile what it predicts with what it perceives. It still anticipates, still makes predictions, still constructs scenarios, but maintains a certain degree of flexibility. However, this changes radically when emotions such as anxiety, stress, or fear take control of the system. Under these conditions, the brain begins to operate in maximum protection mode. The priority ceases to be understanding the world and becomes avoiding risks, even if those risks do not actually exist. Anxiety, for example, acts as an amplifier of negative predictions. It reduces tolerance for uncertainty and causes the brain to fill in any blank space with threatening hypotheses. A neutral detail becomes a sign of trouble. A delay becomes rejection. Silence becomes abandonment. The brain is not calmly evaluating data. It is trying to anticipate the worst possible scenario because it believes that this will make it more prepared. The hidden truth is that this preparation rarely helps. It only generates emotional exhaustion. Prolonged stress produces a similar but even more subtle effect. It keeps the brain in a constant state of alert, even when there is no immediate danger. In this state, the predictive system loses accuracy. It begins to overreact to small stimuli, as if every situation were a potential threat. Decisions are made based on the fear of making a mistake, not on an analysis of the present. The mindset narrows, the field of perception shrinks, and reality begins to seem more hostile than it actually is. Fear, in turn, is perhaps the most powerful trigger of distortion. When fear enters the scene, the brain practically abandons curiosity. It doesn't want to explore, understand, or question. It wants to flee, avoid, protect itself. In this mode, predictions become rigid. The brain begins to rely almost exclusively on negative past experiences, using them as a basis for interpreting everything that happens now. The impact of this is profound, because the present ceases to be lived as it is and becomes filtered through memories of threat. Fatigue also plays a crucial role in this process. A tired brain has fewer resources to revise its own predictions. It relies even more on shortcuts, old patterns, and automatic responses. That's why, when we're exhausted, we tend to misinterpret simple situations, react disproportionately, and make decisions that we later don't quite understand. It's not a lack of character nor emotional weakness. It's a system operating at its limit, trying to conserve energy at any cost. When these emotions combine, the effect intensifies. Anxiety with tiredness, stress with fear, all of this creates fertile ground for distorted predictions. The brain begins to predict threat where none exists. It reads danger in neutral faces, negative intentions in common gestures, rejection in normal silences. And the more often this prediction is repeated, the more convincing it becomes internally. The feeling of certainty increases, even when the basis of that certainty is fragile. This is one of the most delicate aspects of the human experience, because for those living through it, the sensation is real. The body reacts, the heart races, the mind shuts down. It doesn't seem like a hypothesis. It seems like a fact. And that's exactly what makes this process so difficult to identify while it's happening. The brain doesn't warn that it's operating under emotional influence. It simply delivers the prediction as if it were reality itself. This dynamic has a direct impact on how we conduct our personal journey. Relationships are affected, opportunities are missed, important decisions are postponed or made hastily. Often we look back and think, it didn't make sense to react that way, but at the time it seemed perfectly logical. The logic, however, was serving the emotion, not the facts. There is something profoundly human about this vulnerability. The brain wasn't designed to function perfectly in a complex and emotionally charged world like ours. It was designed to survive. And when intense emotions come into play, survival takes the wheel. Precision sits in the back seat. Understanding this doesn't eliminate emotions, but it changes how we relate to them. When you begin to notice that certain predictions emerge more strongly in certain emotional states, something begins to transform. You start to observe patterns. You realize that certain certainties always appear when you are tired. That certain interpretations arise when you are anxious. That certain fears repeat themselves when old experiences are activated. This perception is not immediate nor simple, but it opens space for a more conscious relationship with your own mental functioning. This awareness creates a small pause between prediction and reaction. And this pause is powerful. It doesn't prevent the brain from predicting, but it allows you to perceive when the prediction may be contaminated by momentary emotions. It is in this space that decisions more aligned with the present begin to emerge. Not through rigid control but through honest observation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a point where these emotional predictions cease to be merely momentary distortions and begin to create experiences that seem intensely real, almost impossible to question. It's in this territory that the brain starts to react as if it were experiencing something concrete, even when everything originated from an emotional anticipation. Before we continue, if this part about emotions and predictions resonated with you in any way, please write it in the comments. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a point where everything becomes especially intriguing, when the brain's error doesn't seem like an error. On the contrary, it seems all too real. So real that questioning it sounds almost impossible. Even when the prediction is wrong, the internal experience comes loaded with emotion, conviction, and often even memory. That's where the mystery of the brain reveals itself most powerfully. When the brain makes a wrong prediction, it doesn't present it as a weak hypothesis. It delivers it as a lived certainty. The body reacts, emotion arises, the mind constructs a coherent narrative around it. The heart races, tension appears, the feeling of "I know that's it" takes over. It doesn't matter if rationally there's no proof. The experience has already been registered as true. And that's precisely what makes these errors so impactful from a psychological point of view. There's a common belief that if something is felt intensely, then it must be true. But the brain doesn't work that way. Intensity is not synonymous with accuracy. In practice, the more emotionally involved the brain is, the more real the prediction seems, even when it doesn't correspond to the facts. Emotion acts as a seal of authenticity. It tells the conscious mind, "Trust this." And most of us do. What few people realize is that the brain doesn't clearly separate prediction, perception, and memory. These processes blend together behind the scenes. When a prediction is made with enough force, it can be registered almost as if it were a memory. Not a clear, detailed memory, but a feeling of familiarity, of recognition, of something that makes sense. This mixture creates a powerful internal experience, difficult to dismantle with logic alone. That's why, even after realizing that something didn't happen as we imagined, the feeling doesn't disappear immediately. The body has already reacted. The emotion has already been felt. The conviction has already taken hold for a few moments. The brain acts as if it were right because, from its point of view, the emotional response was consistent with the prediction made. It doesn't measure external reality, it measures internal consistency. This phenomenon has a profound impact on how we construct our mindset. We begin to trust what we feel more than what we observe. We start to give more weight to internal reactions than to objective facts. This influences important decisions, personal relationships, and even how we interpret our own history. Many choices are not made based on what is happening now, but on what the brain believes is happening. There is also a cumulative effect in all of this. Every time a wrong prediction is experienced as real, the brain learns something. It reinforces that neural pathway. The next similar prediction tends to come even faster, even more convincingly. Gradually, a pattern is created. The person begins to live an internal reality that doesn't always align well with the external world. And the longer this lasts, the harder it becomes to distinguish where the prediction ends and where the perception begins. This is one of the most unsettling revelations about how the human mind works. Knowing that something is irrational isn't enough to stop feeling it. The brain doesn't respond to arguments, but to internal states. It reacts to emotional coherence, not objective truth. That's why, often, even after rationally understanding that an interpretation was wrong, the feeling remains insistent, demanding validation. This doesn't mean we're condemned to live trapped by these internal illusions. But it does mean that the path to dealing with them isn't just about logic. It's about awareness of the process. About the ability to perceive that intense conviction might just be the result of a prediction system operating with incomplete information. This perception already changes the game, because it introduces a healthy little doubt where before there was absolute certainty. When the error seems too real, the brain isn't trying to deceive. It's being consistent with itself. It has combined prediction, emotion, and memory into a single experience. And for it, that's enough. The challenge arises when this internal consistency conflicts with external reality. It's at this point that conflicts, frustrations, and the feeling that something doesn't fit arise, even without knowing exactly what. This mechanism helps explain why some mental experiences are so difficult to verbalize. The person feels something intense but cannot point to concrete facts that justify it. Yet the sensation persists. This generates insecurity, self-criticism, and, in some cases, the feeling of being out of touch with reality. But, in fact, what is happening is a brain reacting based on highly convincing internal predictions. There is something profoundly human in this experience. All of us, at some point in our journey, have intensely believed in something that later proved to be wrong. The impact comes not only from the mistake itself, but from the intensity with which it was experienced. The transformation begins when we understand that feeling something as real doesn't guarantee that it's a faithful reflection of the world, but rather of the internal state we were in at that moment. This understanding does not invalidate emotions. On the contrary, it contextualizes them. It allows us to look at them with more curiosity and less judgment. Instead of fighting against the feeling or blindly accepting it, the possibility arises of observing it as a product of a system that is trying to do the best it can with the tools it has. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's an even more subtle aspect to this process. The way the brain prefers to maintain the coherence of its own narrative rather than admit it was wrong. It's at this point that it begins to adjust narratives, reinterpret events, and protect its predictions, even when reality insists on showing something different. If this idea that error can seem too real resonated with you, comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after all this, an inevitable, almost uncomfortable question arises. Is what we're calling brain error really a defect? Or is it an essential characteristic of how the mind works? The answer completely changes how we interpret these strange experiences, these certainties that fail, and these sensations that seem too real. Perhaps the problem isn't the brain making mistakes, but the expectation that it should perfectly reflect reality. There's a hidden truth that's rarely confronted. The brain wasn't made to reveal the world as it is in all its details and nuances. It was made to allow you to function within it, to act, decide, survive, move forward. The goal was never absolute precision. The goal was always utility. And when you understand that, error ceases to seem like a failure and becomes the inevitable price of constant anticipation. The brain constructs a version of the world that is sufficient to guide its decisions. A coherent, quick, emotionally integrated version. It doesn't matter if this version is incomplete or sometimes distorted. What matters is that it allows action. This logic has shaped our journey as a species and continues to shape our individual mindset. The impact of this appears in every automatic choice, in every immediate reaction, in every interpretation we make without realizing it. When we look at it from this angle, it becomes clear that demanding a faithful representation of reality from the brain is like demanding that a map reproduce the territory with every grain of sand. Such a map would be useless. Too heavy, too slow, too complex. The brain does something similar. It simplifies. It anticipates. It ignores details that don't seem relevant at that moment. And, inevitably, this generates distortions. But these distortions are not accidents. They are natural consequences of the process. This reframing is powerful because it changes the tone of the internal dialogue. Instead of thinking, "my brain has failed," the possibility arises of thinking, "my brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do." This doesn't invalidate the discomfort of strange experiences, but it puts them into context. They cease to be signs of something broken and become signs of a system operating within its limits. Error, in this sense, is not an exception. It's part of the package. Whenever the brain anticipates, it runs the risk of being wrong. But if it didn't anticipate, you would be paralyzed, slow, vulnerable. Constant anticipation is what allows you to navigate the world fluidly. The price is that, from time to time, the prediction doesn't match the facts. And when that happens, the feeling can be intense, confusing, and profoundly real. This understanding has a transformative effect on how we deal with our own mental experiences. Instead of fighting against every strange sensation or misinterpretation, we begin to observe them as part of a larger process. A process that doesn't seek absolute truth but functionality. This changes our relationship with thought itself. The mindset ceases to be punitive and becomes investigative. When you accept that the brain delivers a functional version of reality, it becomes easier to understand why two people experience the same event in such different ways. Each brain constructs its own narrative, based on predictions, emotions, and past experiences. There is no single internal version of the world, only versions that make sense within each individual journey. This understanding reduces the impulse to judge both yourself and others. It also becomes clearer why certain decisions seem obvious at the time and strange later. At the moment of the decision, the brain was operating with the best prediction available, within the emotional and mental context of that moment. Looking back, with more information and less emotional baggage, the decision seems flawed. But that doesn't mean it was irrational. It simply means it was made from an incomplete model, like almost all human decisions. This broader perspective reveals something curious. Many of our pains don't stem from the error itself, but from the expectation that we shouldn't make mistakes. When we believe that the brain should be precise, logical, and faithful to reality all the time, every failure becomes a source of anguish. When we understand that error is structural, it loses some of its emotional weight. It continues to exist, but it ceases to be an attack on our identity or our sanity. This reframing is not an invitation to passivity, nor to the blind acceptance of any internal interpretation. On the contrary, it opens space for a more conscious stance. If the brain delivers functional versions of reality, then we can learn to question them with curiosity, not fear. We can observe when a prediction seems useful and when it begins to generate more negative impact than protection. This shift in perspective is subtle yet profound. It alters how you relate to automatic thoughts, intense emotions, and sudden certainties. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" the question arises, "Is this helpful right now?" This simple change of focus can transform how you deal with internal conflicts, difficult decisions, and disconcerting experiences. The brain will continue to anticipate. It will continue to make mistakes from time to time. That won't change. What can change is the awareness with which you observe this process. And this awareness doesn't eliminate the system, but creates a space for choice within it. A space where the reaction doesn't need to be immediate and where the internal narrative can be revised. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a point where this functional version of reality begins to be actively adjusted by the brain itself, almost like a real-time edit of the experience. It's at this moment that it not only predicts but reorganizes what has been experienced to maintain the coherence of its own internal narrative. If this idea that error is not a defect but a characteristic of the brain made sense to you, comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after understanding that the brain predicts, makes mistakes, adjusts, and protects its own narratives, something much more practical and transformative emerges. What exactly to observe when your mind mistakes reality? Not as an exercise in rigid control or self-censorship, but as a movement of awareness. A more attentive look behind the scenes of one's own thinking. The first point is to understand the speed of your reaction. When your mind responds too quickly, even before you can explain what's happening, there's a good chance you're reacting to a prediction, not a fact. Reality tends to be slower, more ambiguous, more open to interpretation. Predictions, however, arrive fully formed, with conviction, with embedded emotion, demanding an immediate response. Observing this difference already changes a lot. Another important sign is the feeling of absolute certainty. When something seems indisputable internally, when the mind closes off all other possibilities and presents a single interpretation as the final truth, it deserves attention. The brain loves certainties because they save energy. Doubt requires effort. Questioning requires time. Prediction offers immediate comfort. This doesn't mean the certainty is wrong, but it means it may not be complete. It's also crucial to observe the body. Even before formulating a clear thought, the body often reacts. Tension, tightness in the chest, racing, discomfort. These physical responses often arise as a direct result of an internal anticipation of threat, rejection, or error. The body reacts to the imagined scenario as if it were already happening. Recognizing this helps to understand that the reaction didn't come from the world, but from the interpretation the brain constructed about it. Another subtle aspect is the narrative that emerges after the reaction. The brain dislikes incoherence. So, after the emotion appears, it creates a story to justify it. A logical explanation that gives meaning to what has already been felt. This narrative may seem very convincing, but it doesn't always stem from the facts. It arises from the need to maintain internal coherence. Observing this movement is one of the most powerful revelations of this process. There is also an important temporal pattern. Many incorrect predictions are repeated in specific states. When you are tired, when you are under pressure, when you relive old emotions or go through times of change. In these phases, the brain tends to use old models, known shortcuts, even if they don't fit well in the current situation. Recognizing these moments in your personal journey helps you not to take everything your mind produces as absolute truth. This is where a crucial point comes in. It's not about controlling the brain. Trying to control thoughts usually generates even more tension. The brain doesn't like to be confronted directly. It responds better when it is understood. Understanding how it works creates a different relationship with your own mind. Instead of fighting against every prediction, you learn to observe it as an open hypothesis. This change in attitude profoundly alters one's mindset. The reaction ceases to be automatic and becomes investigative. A genuine curiosity arises. What is my brain trying to predict now? Where does this certainty come from? Is this a fact I'm perceiving or a story my mind constructed to protect me? These questions don't negate the experience, but rather broaden awareness of it. Over time, this observation creates small spaces for choice. Not grand, dramatic choices, but micro-decisions. Pausing before responding. Breathing before interpreting. Postponing judgment. These small adjustments have a huge impact because they break the automatic cycle between prediction and reaction. Reality ceases to be something that simply happens within the mind and becomes something that can be observed more clearly. There is also an important emotional effect in this process. When you understand that many reactions come from internal predictions, self-criticism decreases. Instead of thinking, "there's something wrong with me," comes the understanding that the brain is doing what it has always done, trying to anticipate, protect, and organize. This understanding doesn't eliminate the discomfort, but it reduces the emotional weight it carries. Over time, you begin to realize that not every intense feeling needs an immediate response. Not every certainty needs to be defended. Not every internal narrative needs to be followed. This doesn't mean disconnecting from emotions but relating to them in a more conscious way. The emotion continues to be felt, but it doesn't need to control all decisions. This process isn't linear. At times you'll clearly perceive the prediction. At other times you'll only notice it after the reaction has already happened. And that's okay. Awareness is built gradually throughout the journey. Each time you realize you reacted to a prediction and not to a fact, something adjusts internally. Your mindset becomes more flexible. Your relationship with your own mind becomes less rigid. The most interesting thing is that, by observing these errors with curiosity, you begin to access a deeper truth about the human experience. The reality we live in is not just what happens outside but what the brain constructs from it. And this construction is always in motion, always being updated, always trying to maintain functional coherence. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there comes a point when this conscious observation begins to reveal something even more surprising. How the brain adjusts memories, interprets the past, and reconstructs experiences to maintain a sense of continuity. That's when we realize that prediction doesn't just act on the future, but also on what we believe we have already experienced. Before we continue, if this idea of observing how your mind reacts to predictions made sense to you, write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, it's because something we've talked about has truly resonated with you. Perhaps not as a definitive answer, but as a new way of looking at your own mind, at those certainties that seem to appear out of nowhere, and at those moments when reality seems to slip away a little. If this message resonated with you, leave a comment below writing, "This message was for me." I read everything, and that also shows me that this type of conversation is worth continuing. If this video helped you better understand how the brain works, how it predicts, makes mistakes, and constructs the reality we live in every day, it's worth subscribing to the channel. The idea here is precisely that, to explore these inner workings of the mind calmly, deeply, and with curiosity, without ready-made answers, but with reflections that truly make a difference. If at any point you felt like you were having a conversation with me, that this content resonated with your own thought process, please like the video. It really helps keep this space alive and brings this kind of content to more people who might be experiencing the same questions. And if you want to continue along this line of reasoning, there's a video over here that complements this topic and further explores the relationship between the brain, perception, and reality. Click there and continue reading.